Hello, my name is Tony Beers, and this is Movie Grades.
And just like the movies, we play out our last scene.
Hello everybody, Tony Beers here again, and in this episode of Movie Grades, I'm going to be talking about The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey.
The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey is about Bilbo Baggins, a hobbit who is asked by the wizard Gandalf to go on an adventure to help a group of dwarves to reclaim their home from a dragon named Smaug, and Bilbo reluctantly accepts.
Now, before I begin this review, I'd first like to say that I've never read The Hobbit, but I have seen the Hobbit animated movie. Now, I haven't seen the animated movie in a long time, but from what I remember, I did like it. The animated style as well as the fantasy storyline also remind me of another animated movie that came out around that time, which was The Last Unicorn. Now, I highly recommend The Last Unicorn. I guess it does really make sense that I liked The Last Unicorn as well as I liked The Hobbit because they were both made by Rankin Bass. However, I did not like the Lord of the Rings animated movie, which this also makes sense since it was not made by Rankin Bass. It was made by Ralph Bakshi. And I also like all three Lord of the Rings movies. So I have liked most of Tolkien's movie adaptations. Another thing I would like to mention before I begin the review is that all the dwarves in this movie are actually average-sized guys that have been shrunk down using CGI or, other technologies. And I think this is kind of unfair to actual little people actors that are out there. I mean, was Warwick Davis and Vern Troyer busy or something? I mean, why couldn't they got these guys in this movie? I just think it's a little unfair. Now, this movie is great, but it's not perfect. But there is more that I liked than I didn't like. So let's get what I didn't like out of the way first. First, it's too long. Now this is something that's very common with most of Peter Jackson's movies, especially King Kong. That was just way too long. So he has a habit of making these movies longer than they need to be. This movie could have been cut down just a little bit, especially when they're going to divide this book up into 3 movies. You gotta save some for the next 2, Peter Jackson. Not all of your movies have to be these huge, epic movies. I mean, in my opinion, movies should be 2 hours or less. There's no reason to make any movie more than 2 hours. And if you got so much story that you need to make more than 2 hours, then split it up and make sequels. Now, having said that, this movie didn't seem that long at all. It was paced very well. I never had to go pee when watching this movie. I actually did have to go pee when I saw Dark Knight Rises, but this movie, I, for some reason, never had to go pee. The next thing is, although the CGI was very well done, it's quite obvious. I always knew when I was seeing a CGI creature. Take movies like The Dark Knight Rises, for example. They actually built a life-size version of the Bat. And since it was there, and it actually was made, it's less obvious when it is CGI. Now, I also think this has a lot to do with the fact that it's more acceptable to see inanimate objects as CGI creations. When you see living creatures, it's more obvious that they're fake, that they're CGI. Now, in this movie, whenever I saw a castle, waterfall, or a statue, or whatever, since they weren't living creatures, since they were things, inanimate objects, it was more believable that they were there. Whereas these trolls or goblins or whatever, I always knew, hey, that's a CGI creature. Comparing that to the dwarves or the elves, who are just people with prosthetics on, seeing them two together just made it that more obvious which was prosthetics and which was CGI. Now, speaking of CGI creatures, the Great Goblin, now I don't know if this is the way he is in the book, but he looked way too big. It just made it harder to believe that he was the same race as these wee little guys. He was at least 20 times bigger than the average goblin, and that just made him stick out even more as being a CGI character. I think they should have made him just a little bit smaller. Of course, he's probably gonna be bigger. I mean, that's probably the way he was in the book, but was he really that big? Now, I could just imagine being this creature's mother and having to give birth to this guy who's 20 times bigger than the average goblin. Another thing that didn't quite make sense is that this movie is supposed to take place 60 years before the events of Fellowship of the Ring. And what's kind of odd is some of the people look exactly the same, if not older, before this is supposed to happen. Take Gandalf, for example. He looks exactly the same 60 years earlier. Now, I know he's a wizard and all like that, but he's got the same beard. He's got the exact same clothes. Clothes styles haven't changed in 60 years. Or maybe he hasn't changed his clothes in 60 years. I mean, it'd be pretty bad smelling, but I thought it was kind of odd. And now that I have all my minor complaints out of the way, let's talk about what I liked. Now, despite the CGI being obvious, it was still very well done. Especially with the landscapes. I mean, all the mountains and valleys and fields and forests and waterfalls and all this stuff. It just looked gorgeous. It looked beautiful. It was really cool the way, like I said earlier, how they took, regular sized guys and shrunk them down. It looked seamless. I mean, there was never a point where I was like, oh, he doesn't look real short there, or that guy looks taller than Gandalf there. No, I never thought that. They all look like dwarfs to me. Especially standing next to Gandalf, you could see how much bigger he was compared to these dwarves, and it always looked good. All the prosthetics look good. All the noses, ears, and wigs and everything look really good. In fact, all these cool beards that these dwarves had, they look so cool that I kind of want to grow my beard out even more than I already have it, so just so I can, braid it or put beads in it or something. But they they really look good. The 3D was really good in this movie. I mean, whenever it's raining, or there's rocks falling at you, or birds flying by, or other creatures or butterflies or whatever flying, it all looked really good, and it helped immerse you in the movie. It helped you feel like you were there. One scene in particular where the 3D looked great was this scene where these giant rock creatures are fighting each other, and they're throwing rocks, and rocks are falling on the dwarves and stuff, and you see the rocks falling. That scene in particular was really good with the use of 3D. All the actors in this movie were great. Especially Andy Serkis as Gollum, Ian McKellen as Gandalf, Martin Freeman as Bilbo, and Richard Armitage as Thorin. There are also some great cameos by other actors from the other Lord of the Rings films, such as Elijah Wood as Frodo, Hugo Weaving as Elrond, and Cate Blanchett as Galadriel, and Christopher Lee as Saruman. In doing some research for this review, I found out that the Great Goblin was played by Barry Humphries. And do you know what character Barry Humphries is best known as? That's right, Dame Edna. So the Great Goblin is actually a transvestite. The story is good. The plot itself is very basic. It's your basic quest story. The characters have to go from point A to point B. But what makes this story great is the interesting characters and all the adventures that happens in between point A and point B. The action in this movie is great. There are a lot of epic battles. There's a lot of swords swinging and arrows flying. It's just a lot of cool action. There's a lot of battles between the dwarves and the orcs. And my favorite battle is between the dwarves and the goblins. This was a really cool, epic battle. And probably my second favorite action scene is that battle between the rock giants that I mentioned before, where these rock giants are fighting each other and they're throwing rocks and stuff, and the dwarves are on these rock creatures and they have to hang on for dear life, you know, and try not to be crushed and squished by these rock creatures. So overall, The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey is a great movie. It's so good, it's going on my best of 2012 list, which I'll be making here pretty soon. So, my final grade for The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey is an A-. My name is Tony Beers, and I'll see you next time.